Valuev.
He got him a hand right. There's the left hook.
Today, we're going back to a time that doesn't really exist anymore. An era before strict weight classes, before carefully curated matchups, before promoters protected assets and fighters built brands. This was the wild age of early MMA and kickboxing, when spectacle mattered as much as skill and the matches felt less like sporting events and more like controlled chaos. You didn't tune in knowing what you'd see. You tuned in because you had no idea what might happen next, and that uncertainty glued people to their screens. Back then, the fights that filled arenas and froze living rooms in silence are ones that would never be sanctioned today. Giants were thrown into rings with men half their size. Genetic outliers, walking experiments in human durability, were matched up simply because someone wanted to know what would happen. There was an electricity to it, a rawness that modern combat sports rarely capture. Every exchange felt dangerous. Every punch carried the promise of something unforgettable. It was freedom and fury, unfiltered and unapologetic. One of the clearest symbols of that era was Jan Norch, known simply as the Giant. Standing 6 feet 11 inches and weighing well into the super heavyweight range, he looked less like a fighter and more like a structure that had learned how to throw punches. Fighting across pride, K1 Strikeforce, and Dream, Norch embodied pure giant striker energy. When he landed, it didn't look technical or precise. It looked like a highway collision. Every strike felt like it displaced air, like the ring itself had to brace for impact. Across from him stood Mighty Mo, a true heavyweight with a completely different mindset. No theatrics, no wasted motion, no interest in playing to the crowd. Mighty Mo's game was simple and brutal. He moved forward, applied pressure, and kept throwing until someone couldn't stay upright anymore. When the bell rang, the visual was almost surreal. It looked like a giant fighting a bear, two massive forces colliding in a space that suddenly felt far too small. The fight didn't take long to reveal its truth. Norch tried to entertain, tried to turn the moment into a show. But showboating doesn't stop momentum. Mighty Mo kept coming, landing, staying composed. And when the moment came, it came fast. One clean sequence, one overwhelming exchange, and suddenly the Giant was down. It was over just like that. No build-up, no slow unraveling. Just a violent conclusion that reminded everyone watching why this era felt so dangerous. You could be enormous, intimidating, seemingly indestructible, and still be shut off in seconds. That same sense of disbelief followed boxing into the 2000s, when Nikolai Valuev stepped into the spotlight. At 7 feet tall, Valuev wasn't just a heavyweight champion. He was an event. When he entered the ring, it felt like someone had wandered in from a different sport entirely. He towered over opponents, his presence alone rewriting the scale of what a boxer looked like. Facing him wasn't just about skill. It was about survival. The fight between Valuev and Monty Barrett captured that perfectly. It was intense, ugly, and exhausting. Barrett tried to find rhythm, tried to time the Giant, but every exchange at close range felt like a gamble with terrible odds. When Valuev's glove brushed the canvas and the referee missed it, you could feel the tension spike. Even when Barrett landed, even when he showed heart and courage, the reality was unavoidable. Taking that many clean shots from a man that size was a long, punishing night. Round after round, Barrett absorbed punishment that would have ended most careers. His courage was undeniable, but so was the danger. Eventually, wisdom won out. The trainer stepped in, ending the fight before something irreversible happened. It was one of those moments that stayed with people not because of a knockout highlight, but because it showed how thin the line was between bravery and disaster in fights like these. That line was crossed often in those days. Fighters like Jimmy Ambrose, an old-school heavyweight who never pretended to be a chess player, made every bout a war. He walked forward, traded, and turned opponents into targets. When he faced an Egyptian giant, there was no mystery about the outcome. Heavy ground and pound followed, relentless pressure, and a finish that felt inevitable. The nickname Pharaoh didn't save anyone when the fists started flying. Even the tallest giants weren't immune to sudden collapse. A 7 feet 1 inch fighter like Hong Man Choi could look untouchable until the exact second he wasn't. One perfect shot, one clean connection, and 15 seconds later the giant was flat on the canvas. Moments like that burned themselves into memory because they shattered the illusion of invincibility. Size mattered, but timing mattered more. Then there were fighters like Yuck Fujimoto, known as Bun Bun Maru, a bald, reckless force of chaos who charged forward with wild swings and zero hesitation. His fights felt like bar brawls scaled up to professional arenas. But chaos cuts both ways. Against Butterbean, that chaos was shut down almost immediately. Less than a minute into the first round, it was over. No drama, no comeback, just a reminder that even madness has limits. Butterbean himself became a symbol of the era's absurdity and charm. Massive, durable, and deceptively fast, he was proof that unconventional bodies could still thrive in combat sports. Watching him move, joke, taunt, and then suddenly land a crushing right hand was part of the spectacle. When he fought other giants, the ring looked like it might collapse under the combined weight. Somehow, it never did. And then there was Mirko Cro Cop, a man who didn't need to be a giant to hunt them. Calm, patient, ice-cold. Cro Cop built a reputation on dismantling bigger men with surgical precision. He didn't rush. He waited. He timed the moment. And when the kick landed, it ended careers. Watching mountains of muscle fall to a perfectly placed strike became a recurring theme. The bigger they were, the harder they fell, and no one demonstrated that better than Cro Cop. Even the tallest fighters, like the 7 feet 5 inches Montana Silva, eventually met reality. Skill gaps became obvious. Low kicks accumulated. Blood flowed. Movement disappeared. When Montana's head cracked against the canvas after a perfectly timed strike, it was clear that height alone wasn't enough. Technique, experience, and composure ruled the day. Looking back, it's hard not to feel a strange nostalgia for that era. It was dangerous, unpolished, and often reckless. But it was also honest. Fighters were thrown into impossible situations, and sometimes they rose to the occasion in ways that felt almost mythic. Other times they fell spectacularly, reminding everyone just how unforgiving combat sports can be. We don't really get that feeling anymore. The sense that anything could happen, that the rules were loose and the outcomes unpredictable. Today's fighters are better protected, better matched, and better managed. That's progress, without question. But something was lost along the way. The raw spectacle, the madness, the nights when the ring felt too small for the bodies inside it. If this kind of wild, old-school combat sports energy is your thing, there's a lot more where this came from. Let us know which fight or era stuck with you the most, and whether you think the sport was better when it was this unhinged. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for more deep dives into the moments that made fight history impossible to look away from. The chaos didn't slow down after those early spectacles. If anything, it escalated. What made that era so unforgettable wasn't just the size mismatches or the knockouts themselves, but the mindset behind them. Promoters weren't asking whether a fight made sense on paper. They were asking whether it would stop people mid-conversation, whether it would make fans lean forward and forget to breathe. And once that standard was set, the floodgates stayed wide open. You have to remember how different the atmosphere was. Fighters walked into the ring without the aura of untouchable stars. They were warriors, sometimes reckless ones, stepping into situations where logic barely applied. There was no long-term brand strategy at play. One night could define everything. That's why so many of these giants fought with a strange mix of confidence and vulnerability. They looked unstoppable until the exact second they weren't, and that tension lived in every exchange. Take the massive super heavyweights who kept appearing across Japan's fight scene. These men didn't just tower over their opponents, they changed the geometry of the fight itself. Jabs came from angles most fighters had never trained for. Uppercuts felt pointless when the chin was somewhere near the ceiling lights. Commentators joked about it, but underneath the humor was genuine disbelief. You could throw the greatest punch of your life and still barely reach the target. And yet, somehow, people kept finding ways. That's what made these fights gripping. The smaller fighters weren't supposed to win, but they weren't showing up to survive either. They came in believing that speed, timing, and violence could solve almost any problem. Sometimes they were wrong in brutal ways. Other times, they cracked the code for just a moment, and that moment was enough to flip the entire narrative. Crowds lived for those moments. You could feel it through the screen. When a giant stumbled, even slightly, the energy shifted instantly. Gasps turned into roars. A single wobble carried more drama than 10 clean rounds of technical boxing. It was the thrill of watching something impossible start to happen in real time. The giants themselves often leaned into it. Some tried to intimidate with sheer presence, slow steps, and looming shadows. Others embraced the absurdity, waving to the crowd or playing along with the spectacle. But once the bell rang, personality didn't matter. Physics did. Momentum did. And when momentum turned, it turned fast. This is where the era became unforgiving. Defense was optional, and longevity was an afterthought. Fighters traded because trading was expected. Backing up was seen as weakness. The idea of pacing yourself over 5 rounds felt almost foreign. These were clashes, not chess matches. And when someone went down, they didn't just fall. They crashed. You'd see giants hit the canvas and stay there, staring up in confusion, as if shocked that gravity still applied to them. Smaller fighters would stand over them, barely believing what they'd just done. Those images burned into highlight reels and collective memory. They became proof that no amount of size could guarantee safety. At the same time, some giants learned to weaponize their durability. They absorbed shots that would have folded normal heavyweights, marched forward, and forced opponents into exhausting exchanges. Watching someone land clean punch after clean punch, only to see the giant barely react, was its own kind of horror. It drained confidence. It made fighters question their power, their plan, and eventually their will. And that's when things got dangerous. Exhaustion set in. Technique broke down. Hands dropped. One mistake became all it took. This is where so many of those legendary finishes came from, not clean strategy, but accumulated chaos, finally exploding into a conclusion. The commentary from those fights reflects it perfectly. Voices raised, sentences unfinished, disbelief spilling through every call. Even seasoned announcers sounded like fans again, reacting in real time to something they couldn't fully process. They weren't narrating history. They were surviving it alongside everyone else. As the years passed, commissions tightened rules and promotions matured. Matchmaking became smarter, safer, and more sustainable. Fighters became better conditioned, better coached, and better protected. The sport evolved, and in many ways it had to. But when you look back at this era, there's an undeniable rawness that modern combat struggles to recreate. It wasn't polished. It wasn't always fair. Sometimes it wasn't even sane. But it was honest in a way that's hard to fake. You watched because you felt like you were witnessing something that could only happen once. No rematches carefully planned. No guarantees. Just 2 people, wildly mismatched or perfectly disastrous, colliding in front of a stunned audience. That's why these moments still circulate today. Grainy footage, blown-out audio, shaky cameras. And yet they feel more alive than many high-definition fights ever could. They remind us of a time when combat sports flirted openly with madness, when curiosity outweighed caution, and when giants fell just as hard as everyone else. And as we move deeper into these stories, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't just about size or strength. It was about risk. Fighters, promoters, and fans all accepted it together. They knew they were watching something dangerous, something unscripted. And that shared understanding made every second hit harder. Because in that era, nothing felt guaranteed. Not dominance, not safety, not even survival. And that's exactly why people couldn't look away. By the time this era was in full swing, the audience had already been conditioned to expect the impossible. Seeing giants fall no longer felt shocking on its own. What shocked people was how quickly everything could change. One moment, a fighter looked untouchable, looming over the ring like a moving wall. The next, he was sprawled on the canvas, legs tangled, eyes unfocused, the crowd erupting, as if they'd just witnessed a natural law collapse in front of them. That unpredictability became the heartbeat of early MMA and kickboxing. There were no long feeling-out processes, no cautious openings. From the opening bell, the tension was immediate. Every exchange carried weight because nobody trusted the idea of recovery. If you got hurt, you were probably finished. And if you didn't press the advantage, someone else would. The giants understood this too. Many of them fought with a strange urgency, aware that their size made them attractions, not long-term projects. They were booked because they looked unreal, because people wanted to see if someone that big could actually fight. There was always a sense that the experiment could end at any time, and that knowledge shaped how they moved, how they swung, and how they took risks. Some tried to refine their skills, learning to jab, manage distance, and pace themselves. Others leaned fully into intimidation, trusting that sheer mass would break opponents mentally before the fight even began. But intimidation has limits, and cameras captured those limits in brutal clarity. When fear disappeared, when a smaller fighter stepped in and refused to back up, the giant's advantage began to shrink. This is where psychology took over. You could see it in the eyes. Giants weren't used to being pressured. When someone walked through their power and stayed in their face, it disrupted the script. Suddenly the ring didn't feel so large. Movements became clumsier. Breathing grew heavier. And once panic crept in, technique followed it out the door. The smaller fighters, meanwhile, carried a different kind of burden. They knew they couldn't afford mistakes. A single clean shot could end everything. That forced them to fight with intensity bordering on desperation. They didn't always look smooth or composed, but they were committed. Every step forward was a decision to gamble, and those gambles created some of the most unforgettable moments of the era. Crowds fed off that energy. You could hear the shift in noise when momentum changed. Cheers turned to screams. Laughter vanished, replaced by stunned silence. These weren't polite sporting audiences. They were participants, emotionally invested in the chaos unfolding inches from the ropes. This emotional connection is why so many of these fights feel larger than life even now. They weren't just contests. They were confrontations with scale, fear, and expectation. Watching someone overcome a physical disadvantage, that extreme felt symbolic, almost mythic. It tapped into something primal, the idea that intelligence, courage, or timing could overcome brute force. But for every giant that fell, there were others who learned to impose themselves more effectively. They began cutting off the ring, leaning their weight, forcing clinches, and turning size into exhaustion. Smaller fighters found themselves drowning, trapped under bodies that felt impossible to move. Referees hovered closer. Corners shouted louder. The line between dominance and disaster blurred. And that's where controversy often entered the picture. Late stoppages, missed knockdowns, gloves touching the canvas unnoticed. In a cleaner era, these moments would spark outrage. Back then, they became part of the story. Imperfection was expected. Human error was accepted. It added to the sense that anything could happen, including things that maybe shouldn't. Media coverage reflected that chaos. Commentary wasn't polished analysis, it was reaction. Writers struggled to frame what they'd just seen in traditional language. How do you explain a 7-foot fighter being dropped by a perfectly timed hook from someone half his size? You didn't analyze it. You replayed it, over and over. As promotions grew, they tried to capture that lightning again. Tournaments were designed to accelerate violence. One-night formats forced exhaustion into the equation. Giants faced multiple fights in a single evening, their size becoming both weapon and liability as fatigue piled up. By the final rounds, even the most intimidating figures looked fragile. These tournaments produced moments that felt almost cruel. Fighters limped back to corners, faces swollen, lungs burning, still expected to go out and perform. But audiences loved it. Not because they wanted to see suffering, but because it felt real. There was no illusion of safety. Victory demanded a visible cost. Looking back, it's easy to criticize the lack of regulation, the mismatches, the risks. And those criticisms aren't wrong, but they miss something important. This era wasn't built on ignorance. It was built on curiosity. People wanted to know where the limits were, and fighters were willing to test them. That willingness is what binds all these stories together. Giants stepping into rings knowing they'd be targeted. Smaller fighters accepting terrifying odds. Promoters gambling reputations. Fans leaning forward, knowing they were watching something that could never be repeated in the same way. By the time the sport began to settle into structure, the damage was done in the best possible way. The myths had already been written. The footage already existed. And no amount of modern polish could erase the memory of what it felt like to watch those fights live, heart racing, unsure whether you were witnessing greatness or disaster. Because in that moment, they were often the same thing. As the years rolled on, the reputation of that era grew larger than the fights themselves. What once felt chaotic and unplanned began to look, in hindsight, like a strange proving ground. Not just for fighters, but for the sport as a whole. This was where boundaries were tested in public, where the uncomfortable questions were asked in the most violent way possible. How big is too big? How much punishment is too much? And how long can raw willpower hold back physics? The Giants became symbols of those questions. They were no longer just athletes, they were living experiments. Every time one of them stepped into the ring, the crowd wasn't just watching a fight. They were watching a theory being tested. Would size overwhelm skill? Would reach neutralize speed? Would intimidation crack resolve before the first punch even landed? Sometimes the answers were clear. Other times, they contradicted everything that came before. What made it even more compelling was how quickly narratives flipped. A giant could look unstoppable one night and fragile the next. A single loss could strip away the aura that took years to build. Once that happened, opponents stopped treating them like monsters and started treating them like problems to be solved. And once a problem can be solved, it loses its power. You could see that shift in the way fighters approach these matchups. Early on, smaller opponents often circled, cautious and respectful. Later, they charged in with purpose. They attacked legs, closed distance, and refused to let the giant dictate pace. The fear that once defined these fights began to erode, replaced by strategy and confidence. At the same time, giants who adapted became far more dangerous. They learned to conserve energy, to lean rather than swing, to use their weight as a tool rather than a burden. Clinches became weapons. Pressure became constant. Rings felt smaller than ever as opponents were pinned, smothered, and drained. Watching those fights was suffocating in its own way, a slow grind instead of a sudden collapse. But even in those moments of control, danger lurked. Giants carried power that didn't need wind-up. A short punch, a lazy-looking hook, could still shut everything off. That's what kept audiences hooked. Control never meant safety. Dominance never meant the fight was over. Everyone in the building understood that one mistake could erase everything that came before. Corners played a bigger role than they do today. Trainers shouted desperately, trying to manage chaos with words. Some knew when to pull the plug, saving their fighters from themselves. Others hesitated, letting pride or hope stretch situations further than they should have gone. Those decisions became part of the legend, debated long after the final bell. The visuals from that era still hit hard. Grainy footage of massive bodies collapsing. Slow-motion replays of jaws snapping back. Rings shaking under the weight of fallen giants. Even the imperfections add to the power. It doesn't feel curated. It feels stolen, like you're watching something you weren't supposed to see so clearly. And the fighters themselves carried those nights with them. Some faded into obscurity, remembered only through clips shared online years later. Others leveraged the chaos into lasting fame, becoming cult heroes of a time that no longer exists. But regardless of where they ended up, they were shaped by those moments. You don't walk away from fights like that unchanged. As rules tightened and matchmaking became more careful, giants slowly disappeared from main events. Not entirely, but the wild mismatches became rarer. The sport decided, collectively, that curiosity had limits, that spectacle needed boundaries, that safety mattered, and, in many ways, that decision saved careers and maybe lives. Still, when fans talk about what they miss, they rarely mention technique or rankings. They talk about feeling, about sitting on the edge of their seat, unsure whether they were about to witness brilliance or catastrophe. They talk about giants falling, about silence followed by shock, about moments that made them question what they thought they understood about fighting. That feeling was born in this era. It can't be recreated with rules or production value. It came from risk, from imbalance, from the willingness to let things spiral into the unknown. And once you felt it, even once, it stays with you. Because no matter how refined combat sports become, there will always be something haunting about those early days. A reminder that at its core, fighting is simple and terrifying. Two people enter, and only one leaves standing. And sometimes, the one you least expect is the one still on their feet. By the time the sport began to fully recognize what it had unleashed, the damage and the magic were already intertwined. You couldn't separate the brutality from the beauty, or the recklessness from the revelation. That era had shown the world something fundamental about combat. That size, strength, and intimidation could tilt the scales, but they could never fully control the outcome. And once that truth was exposed, it could never be unlearned. The fighters who lived through those years carried a unique kind of credibility. They weren't just competitors. They were survivors of an unregulated frontier. Every scar, every limp, every highlight and lowlight was a receipt. They had stepped into scenarios where the margins for error were razor thin, and the consequences were immediate. Even those who lost gained a strange kind of respect simply for being willing to try. What stands out most when revisiting those fights isn't just the violence, but the absence of hesitation. Fighters didn't wait for perfect moments. They created them through force. Exchanges happened in flurries, awkward collisions of styles and bodies that shouldn't have been sharing the same space. It looked messy because it was messy, and that messiness made it honest. Audiences sensed that honesty. They didn't need polished storylines or manufactured rivalries. The visual alone was enough. A towering figure across from a smaller, faster opponent told the story before the first punch was thrown. Everything that followed felt like an answer to that story, written in real time with sweat and blood. Even the failures mattered. When a giant gassed out, slumped against the ropes, or crumpled after a clean shot, it wasn't just a loss. It was a lesson. Fighters, trainers, and fans all absorbed it. They learned about endurance, about balance, about the cost of carrying that much mass under pressure. They learned that intimidation fades quickly once fatigue sets in. At the same time, the giants who endured taught lessons of their own. Watching someone that big continue forward through punishment forced people to reconsider ideas about toughness and resilience. Pain looked different on them. Damage registered slower. It made every exchange feel heavier, more consequential, as if the rules of physiology had been stretched but not broken. As these moments piled up, the sport quietly changed. Training evolved. Conditioning became more sophisticated. Game plans grew more deliberate. Fighters studied the past, watching these wild clashes not just for entertainment, but for insight. The chaos became a textbook, its pages written in knockouts and near disasters. Yet no amount of analysis could fully capture what it felt like in the moment. Sitting there, watching live, knowing that something irreversible might happen at any second. That sense of danger is what people remember. It's why clips from that era still circulate, stripped of context, still powerful decades later. There's also a bittersweet edge to it all. We know now that some of those risks were unnecessary, that some careers ended too early, that some fighters paid long-term prices for short-term spectacle. It's impossible to ignore that reality. And yet, without those risks, the sport might never have reached its current level of understanding or respect. That contradiction is the legacy of the era. It was wrong and right at the same time. It pushed too far but it pushed forward. It showed the world both the potential and the peril of human competition when limits are tested without restraint. When modern fans look back and say they miss those days, they're not asking for chaos to return unchecked. They're mourning a feeling, the sense that you were watching something raw and unscripted, something that hadn't yet been polished into predictability. They miss the uncertainty, the immediacy, the knowledge that history was being written in ways that couldn't be planned. And that's why these stories still matter. They remind us where the sport came from and what it cost to get here. They remind us that progress is built on risk, and that every rule exists because someone once crossed a line that didn't yet exist. As we move toward the end of this journey, one truth becomes impossible to deny. That era, with all its flaws and excesses, gave combat sports something irreplaceable. A mythology, a set of moments so extreme, so unfiltered, that they continue to shape how we understand fighting itself. Because once you've seen giants fall, once you felt that collective gasp ripple through a crowd, you never quite forget it. By the time the dust finally settled on that era, the sport had already moved on, but the echoes never really faded. Rules were tightened, commissions grew stricter, and matchmaking became far more deliberate. On paper, everything improved. Fighters were safer. Careers lasted longer. The chaos was reduced. Yet somewhere along the way, the atmosphere changed, and the memory of those early days began to feel almost unreal, like a fever dream the sport had once collectively shared. What lingered wasn't just the imagery of giants crashing to the canvas, or smaller fighters defying impossible odds. It was the feeling that accompanied those moments, a feeling of witnessing something that might not be allowed to happen again. When people talk about that time now, there's a certain tone in their voice, a mix of awe and disbelief, as if they're not entirely sure what they saw was real until they watch the footage again. Those fights exist as artifacts of a transitional period, when combat sports were still discovering what they were. They weren't bound by modern expectations or polished narratives. They were experiments conducted in front of live audiences, with real consequences and no safety net. Every bout answered a question, and sometimes raised 10 more in the process. The giants, in particular, became legends not because they always won, but because they represented the unknown. They forced everyone to confront uncomfortable realities about fairness, danger, and the limits of the human body. Watching them succeed felt astonishing. Watching them fail felt shocking. Both outcomes carried weight, and neither was easily forgotten. For the fighters who stood across from them, those moments defined careers. A single victory over a towering opponent could cement a legacy forever. A single loss could still earn respect if it came with courage and resolve. In that environment, reputation wasn't built on records alone. It was built on moments, on whether you showed up when the stakes felt absurdly high. As fans, people didn't just consume those fights. They experienced them. They remember where they were, who they were watching with, and how the room reacted. Silence before knockout. Screams after one. Laughter mixed with shock. These weren't passive viewing experiences. They were shared emotional events. Modern combat sports rarely produce that same collective reaction, not because the athletes aren't incredible, but because the unknown has been narrowed. We understand the sport better now. We can predict outcomes more accurately. The rules guide behavior. The edges have been sanded down. And while that's undeniably good for the fighters, it changes how the audience feels. That doesn't mean the old days were better. It means they were different. They belonged to a moment when curiosity outweighed caution, and when the sport was still writing its own language. Every punch, every fall, every stoppage contributed to a vocabulary that fighters and fans still use today, even if they don't always realize it. The legacy of that era lives on in highlights, in stories passed down, and in the occasional matchup that feels just a little too risky to be comfortable. When those moments happen, people recognize the feeling instantly. A flash of the past. A reminder of what it used to be like when nothing felt guaranteed. And maybe that's the true value of looking back. Not to glorify the danger, but to understand the journey. To appreciate how far the sport has come and what it took to get here. To remember that behind every rule and every safeguard is a moment when someone learned a hard lesson in real time. Those early giants, those fearless challengers, and those unforgettable nights all played a role in shaping what combat sports are today. They were part of a necessary growing pain, a chapter that couldn't be skipped, even if it couldn't last forever. So when we revisit that wild era of early MMA and kickboxing, we're not just indulging nostalgia. We're honoring a time when the sport dared to test itself, when the outcome wasn't polished or predictable, and when the ring felt like a place where anything could happen. And if you've made it this far, chances are that part of you misses that feeling too. The shock, the danger, the raw honesty of it all. If that's the case, let us know what moments from that era still stick with you, and which fights you think could never happen today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned, because the stories of combat sports are far from over, and the past still has a lot left to teach us.